Hi, I'm Sydney Walden, and I did my practicum project on repositioning slings. My practicum hours were completed in a hospital setting on a neurology and epilepsy floor. This floor has 25 beds and can take patients with floor and progressive orders. This floor can take patients 16 years old and above. My practicum hours were completed with the patient care manager of this unit. Another interesting fact about the unit I did my practicum hours on was that they took scheduled epilepsy admissions. So the patients were having seizures at home, and they would try to mimic that same environment within the hospital so that their seizures can be witnessed in a controlled environment, and they can make a plan on how to treat these seizures depending on what type they have. The goal of my Capstone Project was to reduce musculoskeletal injuries among nurses and to decrease the occurrence of pressure injuries among patients by increasing the use of repositioning slings and the mechanical lift. This topic is important because in 2012, healthcare providers suffered more musculoskeletal injuries than construction, mining, and manufacturing workers. According to Liberty Mutual, which is the largest workers' compensation insurance provider in the United States, overexertion injuries, including lifting, pushing, pulling, holding, carrying, or throwing an object, cost employers $13.4 billion each year. According to American Nurse Today, one estimate suggests that the average nurse lifts 1.8 tons per shift. The 2014 International Pressure Ulcer Guidelines state that healthcare workers should use manual handling aids, such as the repositioning sling, to reduce friction and shear. Lift, don't drag the individual while repositioning. My learning objectives are as follows. First, perform an assessment on the nursing staff's knowledge of the appropriate use of repositioning slings and the appropriate use of the mechanical lift, and find out what their barriers to use are. Next, develop educational materials that teach about the importance of using repositioning slings and when to put them into practice according to UK's best practice policy. And finally, to discuss with my preceptor the data I collect from her nursing staff and to positively influence her to enforce the use of repositioning slings on the unit. For the implementation of my project, I first developed a questionnaire to send out to staff on the unit in order to assess their knowledge, current use of repositioning slings, and barriers to use of repositioning slings. Next, I developed an educational flyer to hang around the unit in places such as the break room and what we call the potty press, or on the wall of the bathroom. Next, I sent the questionnaire out again to determine if the staff learned anything from my educational material posted around the unit and the flyers that I handed out to the nurses I saw in the hallway. And finally, I presented the data I collected to my preceptor, and I hope that the information I gathered will make a positive impact on this unit. These are the questions that were in my questionnaire. Number 1, do you use a repositioning slings on patients who score less than a 5 on the mobility scale? Scoring a 5 would be that they can ambulate around the room and the hallway on their own and can turn independently every 2 hours. 2, do you reposition your patients every 2 hours, like it says to do in UK's best practice guidelines? 3, do you use the mechanical lift when repositioning your patients? And 4, do you believe that the use of repositioning slings and the mechanical lift is beneficial for the nurse and the patient? So these are my initial questionnaire results. For question 4, which is do you believe that the use of repositioning slings and the mechanical lift is beneficial for nurse and patients, 91% of the staff said yes. 3, do you use the mechanical lift when repositioning your patients? 8% of the nursing staff said yes, so that's not very good. 2, do you reposition your patients every 2 hours? 41% of the nursing staff said that they did. And 1, do you use a repositioning sling on patients who score less than 5 on the mobility scale? And 16% of nurses said that they did. So my final results, or my results after my educational material. After sending out the questionnaire again following my education, There was a huge improvement in the answers to question 1, which addressed using repositioning slings on patients who score less than a 5 on the mobility scale. This result improved from 16 to 40%. The results to question 2, which addressed repositioning your patients every 2 hours, also improved from 41% to 60%. I did not see any improvement in my results for questions 3 and 4. Question 3, I will address the barriers the nurses presented to me later on in the presentation. In question 4, I already had 91% say that they already did this, so I didn't expect much improvement there. What I saw in my practicum. The nursing staff did not have immediate access to mechanical lifting devices such as the ceiling lift. Repositioning slings were not being used like they should be according to UK's best practice policy. What I read was that mechanical lifts should be available to healthcare providers to reposition patients each time they are needed. Repositioning slings should be used on all patients who score less than a 5 on the mobility scale, which means, or 5 is, can ambulate and reposition independently. The barriers to use that the nurses presented to me. The nurses stated that due to working in an older part of the hospital, they do not have access to the ceiling mechanical lifting devices. They instead have to use a portable device that is large and bulky and has to be shared with their entire floor. They have semi-private rooms on this unit, which means they are shared by multiple patients, so there's 2 to 3 beds in a very small combined space, and they do not have room to bring in the portable mechanical lift. So not to mention, do you have 2 to 3 beds in a small space, but you also have their belongings, their family members, so there just isn't room for this big, bulky device. The nurses expressed a desire for the ceiling mechanical lifts to be installed. Instead, if they were readily available, they would use them when repositioning their patients more often. So when to use the repositioning sling according to UK's best practice policy. Repositioning slings need to be a part of the bed makeup for any patient that scores less than a 5 on the mobility scale or cannot turn independently every 2 hours. The repositioning sling should be attached to the ceiling lift every time you need to turn these patients or move them up in the bed. And this is an example of how to properly use one. The personal effect of my practicum. I spent my practicum experience shadowing a patient care manager. Throughout my time this semester, I was able to sit in on interviews for potential employees and give my opinion. I was also able to go to manager-only meetings that addressed the staffing crisis in the hospital, which was a huge opportunity for me and really opened my eyes. And without my practical experience, I would never know, number 1, that these go on, but number 2, what goes on in these meetings. This also showed me how hard my own manager works to staff my unit. I was able to listen in as the manager handled conflict between staff members. Thank you for listening to my practicum experience. These are my references.